Good morning. Today we're going to begin, or good afternoon or evening, depending on when you're viewing this. We're going to start Chapter 9, our chapter on developmental psychology. If you're one of our psychology majors, you'll be taking either our lifespan course or our child psychology course or our adolescent psychology course. And if you are not a psychology major, you might still consider one of these courses. They count as both a social science elective and a liberal arts elective. In this chapter, we're going to be introduced to major theorists, including Jean Piaget, Erik Erikson, who we're slightly familiar with already, I hope, and Lawrence Kohlberg, Kubler-Ross, and we'll learn many of the general principles of development. In this course, we'll look at development really from conception right through old age, so I think we'll all be able to find many useful bits in this course. So again, let's get started. Developmental psychology studies how we change across the lifespan in three distinct areas: physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. We offer a few developmental courses at the college. Child psychology is a 4-credit course designed especially for people that will be teaching toddlers or infants. Developmental psychology, Psych 222, studies development from before birth, in other words, prenatal development, through senescence, aging. We also have adolescent psychology, which is a great course for individuals that will be working with adolescents. If you are interested in working with adolescents, there is a criminal justice course called juvenile delinquency that also might be of great interest, even though it is not a developmental psychology course per se. We're going to start by examining three basic issues in developmental psychology. The first is development in its nature, continuous or discontinuous. Continuous implies that there's no substantial difference from, let's say, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Discontinuous, on the other hand, suggests that there are distinct differences. With a theory that lists stages, such as the Kohlberg theory of development of morality, Piaget's theory perhaps, Erikson's theory, we'll be discussing all those in this particular chapter. They all have stages. Would that imply continuous or discontinuous development? If you said discontinuous, we're right. If you hear gentle rattling and tapping and jiggling in the background, please try to ignore it. That's Bailey, my new rescue dog. He's been here for just 24 hours. Another basic issue of development is there one course of development or are there many? One course would suggest that all children follow a very similar path. Many would suggest that there are distinct paths that would be influenced by the unique combination of genetics and environment experienced by the child. Your textbook gives the example of the parenting style of the Ache Native Americans of South America and Paraguay. The forest environment is dangerous, things that can put into the baby's mouth, wildlife that could be dangerous, spiders, snakes, and so on. So the Ache mothers will carry the infants upon their body for 2 years. So at 2 years, the Ache baby's motor ability is quite comparable to an American's ability at 1 year of age. That should, if there's one course of development, produce very different developmental outcomes. The Ache baby should not have the same degree of competence and motor skills that an American baby would have. But that is hardly the case. Ache children, for example, at 9, are far ahead of American children, suggesting in fact that there are many courses of development. In a different example, I gave you a picture of Native American parents, a Native American woman with her infant in a cradle board on her back. Same idea. In Native American culture and many cultures, people are nomadic and moving and cannot place the baby in a playpen or a crib, so the baby is much safer on the back. Although the babies will initially lag behind in motor skills, they will rapidly catch up to children in cultures that were allowed more free movement. I thought it might be interesting to show you what the Aceh people look like. On the left-hand side, you see Aceh ceremonial makeup, which you would probably not see unless you were at a festival. If you visit the Aceh, you'll probably more see a scene on, like on the right, that crowd of people is rooting for their children at a soccer tournament. Let's pause for a moment and do a concept check. So these two stage theories, would they reflect a belief in continuous or discontinuous development? Hopefully you said discontinuous. In our second example, Julie is insisting that a condition is due to genetics, while Manuel believes it's due to environmental factors. So which person has the nature and which one has the nurture perspective? Hopefully you said that Julie has the nature perspective and Manuel has the nurture perspective. For a third theme or basic issue of development, let's consider nature versus nurture. We've discussed this earlier in the course. Let's see if you remember the terms. Take a moment and decide what is meant by nature and what is meant by nurture. I'll give you a moment. So nurture, hopefully you remembered, refers to that which is due to learning and environment. Whereas nature refers to what is due to genes and genetics and heredity. Today's focus is moving beyond which is more important to looking at the interaction between the two. Developmental psychologists that are interested in exploring the nature and nurture interaction will probably use either the adoption or twin study, two research methods that we have not discussed earlier in the course, but will now tackle. Let's start with the adoption study. For the adoption study, let's assume that the researcher is researching some particular topic: schizophrenia, left-handedness, personality, intelligence. They'll need to go to an adoption registry. Typically, the U.S. is not utilized because adoption registries are closed. They'll go to a country that has an open adoption registry, such as many of the Scandinavian countries. They'll then pull the records of children that have a particular characteristic they're interested in. And then they'll compare, is that child more similar to their adoptive parent, with whom they share no genetics in common, or is that child more similar in that trait to the biological parent who they've shared no environmental or learning with, but do share genetics? And that will give a nice clean answer in terms of which is more important for that particular trait, nature or nurture. A second type of study would be the twin study. In the twin study, we'll be looking at the basic types of twins. Do you know the two basic types of twins? If you're thinking fraternal and identical, absolutely. I always ask my class to tell me how an identical and fraternal twin form. Many students are not clear on the process. So let's start with maybe the identical twin. In this case, the mother will release one egg cell. That one egg cell is fertilized by one sperm, the same as for any other conception. But at some point along the way, that structure, that zygote cleaves, hopefully to two clean, distinct sections. Otherwise, we would get into the Siamese, or in modern terminology, the conjoined twin situation. But after those two copies have separated, you now have two identical copies. Here's a couple questions. Do those two twins have to be the same sex? Hopefully you're saying yes, because otherwise they wouldn't be identical. Here's a harder question though. What percentage of genetic material do those two identical twins share in common? If you're thinking 100%, you're correct. Now let's consider the fraternal twins. In that circumstance, the mother would release 2 or perhaps more eggs, and each egg would get fertilized by a different sperm. So to the 2 questions we asked before, can they be of different sexes? Absolutely. And a harder question, what percentage of genetic material did those fraternal twins share in common? Well, it would be the same as any other set of children in a family, any other set of siblings, if that helps. If you're saying 50%, you are indeed correct. So in the twin study, we'll compare these twins. Some are fraternal, some are identical, and they would all have the characteristic being studied. And we would see if in identical twins, there'd be a higher rate of that characteristic than fraternal twins. If there's a much higher rate in identical twins, clearly genetics is playing a more substantial role. If there's the same rate of that particular trait or disorder in the 2 types of twins, we'll see that genetics is not clearly playing a more substantial role. So that would say the environment appears to be more substantive in that particular example. 2 methods specific to developmental psychology are the twin and the adoption study. We'd use them if we wanted to investigate the nature versus nurture theme. Well, another set of research methods that are also used extensively in developmental psychology would be 2 methods that study age-related change. In other words, how we change across the lifespan. You can see that they're the longitudinal and cross-sectional study. In the longitudinal study, you see the word long, and that will help you. You follow the same group of people for a extended period of time. So for example, maybe we want to follow a group of people from age 2 to age 8. That study would obviously take us 6 years. Good longitudinal studies may last a decade or more. When they come out, they generate a lot of sensation in the academic community, and they're cited quite extensively. They're quite important, but they are quite difficult and expensive to conduct. Another alternative, which is not quite as strong, but still very useful, is the cross-sectional study. In a cross-sectional study, we'll get a group of subjects of different ages and study them at the same time. So maybe the researchers, in a matter of a week or 2 or 3, might investigate their topics of interest in a group of 2-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and 8-year-olds. So instead of waiting 6 years, they can gather that data in weeks because they're viewing people of all those ages at the same time. The big problem with the cross-sectional study is that we're not sure that the differences between the younger individuals and the older individuals are due to aging. Maybe they're due to something cultural that's going on. For example, maybe the internet was introduced, maybe social change occurred, maybe they grew up in a particular time in history. So although we would want to conclude the differences in the cohorts were due to aging, we're not positive, and that's its downfall. Next, let's look at the 3 stages of prenatal development. The ages are listed on the slide, but take a moment and can you think of the name which should be applied to each stage? The first stage is often called the germinal stage, but most people know it as the stage of the zygote. Next stage of the embryo. The third stage, the stage of the fetus. These ages are very student-friendly. Consider stage 2 begins at week 2 through the end of month 2. Stage 3 begins at the beginning of month 3, so very student-friendly. Now, if you had any trouble spelling those words, you'll find them in the next slide in turquoise for you. Next, let's consider the topic of teratogens. The study of it is teratology. That's the topic that I did my master's on in graduate school. Teratogens can cause harm when the developing zygote or embryo or fetus is exposed to them. Some are easily avoidable, others not at all. So let's look at some examples. Alcohol and other drugs. Often students will want to say caffeine or nicotine. Well, remember, caffeine and nicotine are other drugs. Now, these other drugs can be street drugs, commonly used drugs such as tobacco, which is not a street drug, and some can actually include prescription drugs. Bacterian foods. Can you think of any foods that pregnant women should avoid based on bacteria that could be in them? Well, apparently unpasteurized honey, uh, heavily processed foods like salami. Women should definitely not do rare hamburger, for example, or if you thought sushi, you are correct. X-rays. Women are typically asked in, say, a dental office, could they possibly be pregnant? X-rays are a teratogen. Consider some diseases that can be passed from mother to child either prenatally or in the birthing process. What can you come up with? Go ahead, think of it. You might say HIV, and you are correct. I would like to mention that in this part of this country, it's really almost of no excuse that a baby is born HIV positive if the mother was pregnant in this country. HIV testing is free, and if the mother does have HIV, she can be provided free of cost drugs that will virtually eliminate the possibility that her child will be born HIV positive. So HIV is certainly a good answer. What about the disease that is shown in this picture? That would be the Zika virus. Measles. Women who have not had their measles shot, if they become pregnant, risk having their child exposed to measles prenatally, and that can be devastating. Blindness, deafness, intellectual disability can result. So many diseases are teratogens. What about metals, and how would the woman get exposed to the metals? You might be saying mercury. Well, how would a woman get exposed to mercury? There's no mercury in thermometers anymore. For example, certain fish that are heavy in fats, fish from the Great Lakes, for example, I would not go near. Fish like swordfish are also ocean fish that are at risk of having too much mercury. This, of course, was just a partial list. Let's now consider the effects of tobacco on the child. I'm not going to distinguish prenatal from postnatal development. And I say tobacco, not nicotine, because until now, people rarely expose themselves to just nicotine. With vaping, that's new, and we'll probably see much more research that is nicotine specific. But in the past, the woman would have been exposed to smoking, for example, which would not include just nicotine, but literally thousands of other highly dangerous chemicals. I hope you find this picture disturbing. I did. Can you take a moment and think of as many effects that you're aware of tobacco on children? When you've done this, you can switch to the next slide and see how many of them that you were actually able to propose. There is an existing body of knowledge of the effects of marijuana as teratogens, but this research often is of much poorer quality, and certainly we can't give marijuana in a study with an experimental control group and see what happens to the children in the experimental group. That would be obviously highly unethical. So these studies are correlational in nature. But with the recent number of states that are legalizing marijuana for recreational use, we'll see much more numerous studies and probably much higher quality of studies. But one documented outcome is a significantly higher rate of learning disabilities in these children. We know that children that have been exposed to tobacco have a significantly higher rate of SIDS. This does not mean that every SIDS baby was exposed to tobacco, and certainly not every tobacco-exposed baby will experience SIDS. Do you know what the letter SID stand for? If you're thinking sudden infant death syndrome, you are correct. Lung issues, definitely. 20% of American children have asthma. Tobacco exposure is a major cause. Ear infections are much more common in children that are regularly exposed to tobacco smoke. Cancers. Certain cancers are much more prevalent in the children of smokers. What a terrible thing to do to one's child. Lower birth weight. On average, tobacco-exposed children weigh a half-pound less. Now, a half-pound to your eye is nothing, but if you only weigh 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 pounds, a half a pound is a very big deal. Babies with lower birth weight have a significantly lower rate of survival. Also, potentially lowered IQ. Some correlational studies suggest that on average, the children of smokers have 7 IQ points lower. And 7 IQ points is a big deal. If I give you 7 extra IQ points, take it and run, it would make your college life easier. If I tried to steal 7 of your IQ points, don't let me, that would make your college life considerably harder. These are just some of the effects of tobacco on children. We noted that prescription drugs can also be teratogens. Have you ever heard of the drug thalidomide? And are you aware of what specific effect it had on the children exposed to it? Take a moment and think about that. If you notice, the PowerPoint had an E on it and the picture of the drug did not, and we're wondering, let me explain it. Every drug has 3 names. It has the brand name, the generic name, and the highly chemical name. So, for example, if you like Excedrin, it's the same thing as acetaminophen, but Excedrin would be the brand name. We know that children that have been exposed to tobacco have a significantly higher rate of SIDS. This does not mean that every SIDS baby was exposed to tobacco, and certainly not every tobacco-exposed baby will experience SIDS. Do you know what the letter SID stand for? If you're thinking sudden infant death syndrome, you are correct. Lung issues, definitely. 20% of American children have asthma. Tobacco exposure is a major cause. Ear infections are much more common in children that are regularly exposed to tobacco smoke. Cancers. Certain cancers are much more prevalent in the children of smokers. What a terrible thing to do to one's child. Lower birth weight. On average, tobacco-exposed children weigh a half-pound less. Now, a half-pound to your eye is nothing, but if you only weigh 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 pounds, a half a pound is a very big deal. Babies with lower birth weight have a significantly lower rate of survival. Also, potentially lowered IQ. Some correlational studies suggest that on average, the children of smokers have 7 IQ points lower. And 7 IQ points is a big deal. If I give you 7 extra IQ points, take it and run, it would make your college life easier. If I tried to steal 7 of your IQ points, don't let me, that would make your college life considerably harder. These are just some of the effects of tobacco on children. All these children were exposed to thalidomide prenatally, and as soon as the babies began to be born, the shocking and clearly and quickly linked to thalidomide. These children are sometimes called flipper babies because the arm is often a flipper-like appendage. Back in high school, my best friend's cousin was a thalidomide baby. Her arms were about roughly normal length, a little bit shorter, same with her legs, but they were fused with limited mobility at slightly odd angles, and her toes and fingers were also fused as well. At that point, even though she was a young woman, she had over 20 surgeries trying to give her greater mobility and use of her arms and legs. Let me tell you a little bit of the history of this drug. This drug was first created in Germany. The company called it a wonder drug and claimed it cured everything from acne to impotence. One thing it did, though, was help to deal with nausea, and who's nauseous but pregnant women. So the FDA was doing a very limited trial of about 20,000 individuals. And the sad thing about this in particular was it was never adequately tested on animals. If it had been given the typical animal testing before moving to the human trials, this entire tragedy could have been prevented. No one likes animal testing. I certainly don't, but given the choice of giving it a drug to pregnant women or pregnant rats, I'll take pregnant rats 10 times out of 10, and I suspect you might too. Let's consider SIDS and the newer term which has in part replaced it. We already said that SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome. SIDS is in the category of SUID. SUID, are you familiar with the term? Quite possibly not. SUID is sudden unexpected infant death. SIDS is in the category of SUID. So the SUID is unexpected. SIDS is unexplained. When a child is found dead of SIDS, there is no clear cause. We do know risk factors for SIDS. I definitely put them into your notes. We know that improper sleep position. In the old days, babies are often put to sleep on their back, which is a choking risk, so doctors encourage women and fathers to put the baby on the belly. That decreases the choking risk, but greatly increases the SIDS risk. Many doctors are preferring now the side sleeping position. Maternal drug use during pregnancy is also a SIDS risk factor, and also lack of prenatal care. So again, the three SIDS risk factors would be improper sleep position, maternal drug use, and lack of prenatal care. Now in the SUDS category, SUIDS, SIDS is included, but also in the SUIDS category are known causes. For example, if the baby became entrapped, for example, maybe the baby's face was positioned between the mattress and a pillow. If a baby was laid on a waterbed, never lay a baby on the waterbed because the waterbed will encircle the child's face and they could also die. Infections would also be another SUID cause. So again, SIDS is a subcategory of the SUID.